So we're going to be talking about fall pasture management. And what do I mean when I say fall pasture management? It's not about using up the season's pastures leftovers. It's not about just turning the animals out there into all of the pasture and seeing how long they can go and collect every last blade of grass. That's not really what we want to do in the fall. What fall pasture management is really about is having a plan for what you want to do with your fall pastures. It's having a plan to allow your grasses to create carbohydrate reserves so that they can survive winter, get a strong early start in the spring, and to produce a lot of forage next year. And so it's about how much forage dry matter you're going to produce next year. Our decisions now in the next month are really going to determine what next year's dry matter production is going to be. So with that, we need to understand that plants need a time to rest and prepare for winter. Your job is to coordinate your management strategies, your decisions with what you know about the grass's annual life cycle's needs. And the information that I'm talking about is relevant to hayland as well. A lot of people will turn their cattle in to graze the aftermath. And if we don't do that carefully, we can be setting back next year's hay production as well. It's a great thing to be able to do that, but we need to do it in an intelligent way. So just what is the plant doing at this time of the year? We're at the end of September going into October. We had a couple of hard frosts. So in the last month, there's been a fair amount of root regeneration, recovering from some of the summer shedding. We had a dry period of summer. You know, the plants respond to that. They shed some roots. We've been grazing all summer. If we've grazed hard, they've been shedding some roots. And so at this time of the year, they're actively growing some additional roots, and those roots are critical to supply the water and the nutrients to the development of the tillers on the plants, which has been occurring over the last 2 to 3 to 4 weeks. So just like I said, our plants, our grasses are growing, new shoots are growing points, and these will be next year's production. So we want to make sure we take good care of this year's, of these tillers that are developing on our plants right now. These new tillers over the last month may have developed between 1.5 to 4 leaves. And we don't really want to graze much of those leaves because we want those tillers to be in good shape to survive the winter. The plant is actively storing carbohydrates. It takes a lot of signals from its environment, day length and so forth, and it begins to store carbohydrates because it's going to have to survive a long period of winter where it's not going to be actively photosynthesizing and using up reserves of carbohydrates. The plants are alive all winter long and they're respiring all winter long using up those reserves. And in grass plants, the majority of these reserves are actually in the lower stems and crown. They're above the soil surface. They're in the bottom 2 to 3 to 4 inches of those plants, depending on the species. If you graze these stored carbohydrates, your next season's tillers are going to be starved. And that's why people that have grazed really hard in the fall wonder why they're not getting the same yield the next year in that field. So let's take a quick look at some plants here, and there are 2 of them. One is orchard grass, which is a bunch grass, and then the other one is quack grass, which spreads. And so let's take a close look at this orchard grass on the left, which is one of the most common grasses in our pastures in Delaware County. You can see that there's this tiller in the center here that's quite tall, and it's quite large in diameter compared to the other tillers. And that's the plant that's been producing most of the forage this past year. When you maybe you grazed in the spring and then you came in and clipped those pastures, orchard grass, if you clipped it at 4 or 5 inches, it's going to begin to tiller. And maybe this secondary tiller on the right is one of those that started growth at that point. And the smallest one here, maybe that was one that started towards the fall of the year to help develop its reserves and get ready for next year. And if we look really close here, in this area here, you can see this axillary bud, and that has the potential to turn into a tiller. So the main meristem where all these growing points start, everything starts out as a little bud. This may or may not make it into a tiller. So the difference here with the quackgrass is that it spreads out laterally instead of a bunch. And you can see the various rhizomes here, and the various nutillers are growing from nodes within that rhizome. So the two plants behave a little bit differently. So what happens when our plant is grazed? And the answer is really depends. We need to know something about the species of grass to know where the growing points are. So in this particular diagram, we see orchard grass and meadow fescue, and you can see there's a big difference. If we grazed at this height, in both of these cases, the stored carbohydrates are below the point where we grazed, so we're not really setting that plant back much. But you can see with the meadow fescue, the carbohydrates are much lower in the bottom inch or so, and so we could actually graze that a little bit more if we wanted to. So let's take a look a little bit closer at that orchard grass and that concept of grazing the height. So here again, if we graze this height on this orchard grass 4 or 5 inches above the area of the plant where all the carbohydrates are reserved, or stored, excuse me, the new leaves that are growing are largely coming and utilizing energy that the plant is actively photosynthesizing in the remaining leaves. And you can see that there's very little carbohydrates that need to come from the reserves that have been built up. But if we ate that plant down tighter and we ate a significant portion of the bottom parts of the plant, so let's say we graze this orchard grass down to 2 inches, then we have inadequate residual. There's not enough leaf material and green photosynthetic material left in this bottom part to provide all of the energy to get the next growth going. So the plant has to reach down into its reserves, and it's going to use more of the carbohydrate reserves, and the plant is going to be set back. So it's really, we want to know where the plant is drawing its energy from to determine its regrowth rate. So here's some 2 charts by Garish that really begins to show how that works. So again, we look at, on this chart here, we have the growth rate in pounds per acre per day. That's the rate of the regrowth. And then here we have the residual height that we grazed down to. So you can see that if we graze the plants down to 2 inches, the residual or the growth rate at that point will be somewhere between 30 and 35 pounds per acre per day. But if we only graze down to 5 inches, we come up on this chart, we'll see that at that point, there's enough photosynthetic leaf material left that it can utilize the photosynthate that it's creating every day, and it might grow at 50 pounds per acre per day, that pasture sward. And so if we take a look at, that's also going to affect the amount of time we have to let that plant rest before we can come back. So at 2 inches, if we take it down to 2 inches, in order for the plant to be ready to be grazed again, it might take, close to 40 days. Whereas at that 5 inches, we might be closer to 32 days in these 2 charts here. So we want to be aware of where the plant is storing its energy reserves and try to protect that part of the plant every time we graze. So this has an effect on next year's growth throughout the year, and that's what this here particular chart is looking at. And so it's looking at the residue effects on vegetative orchard grass, and they had 3 different plots here. One they ate down to 1.5 inches of residue height before they moved the cattle, one down to 3 inches, and one down to 6 inches. And as you come across the chart here, you can see that the average rest period when you were at 6 inches was only 24 days before the plant was ready to graze again, whereas at 1.5 inches, it took 44 days. And then you can see that there's a difference in the yield. Obviously, if you take it down to 1.5 inches, there's more there. But when you take a look at it over the course of the year, you can see that it changes. So in this particular case, grazing throughout the year at 3 inches was what produced the most annual yield. However, you can see the impact in the subsequent year. So this is the date that the grass reached 12 inches of height in the subsequent year. And when we were at 6 inches, we were ready to graze it on April 28th, where if we grazed it at 1.5 inches all season long, it took a couple of weeks longer before it was ready to graze again. So this idea, let's begin to focus it on the last part of the year. And so maybe we can graze down to 3 or 4 inches in the middle of the year And then at the end of the year, starting in maybe September, we only graze down to 6 inches. And we begin to protect that plant's ability both to have a lot of leaf area to capture sunlight and create the carbs that it can store, which is what it's wanting to do in the month of September, and still be able to manage something. So when we look at this, on this chart here is the yield in pounds per acre, and we looked at May, June, and August grazing events in the subsequent year. So the green line represents where we graze down in October to just 6 inches of height, and 2 inches we graze down to 2 inches, the yellow line. So you can see the following May, there was only about 725 pounds of dry matter available, where in October we grazed down to 2 inches. But where we only grazed down to 6 inches, in May, we had, looks like 1,050 pounds of dry matter per acre. And this takes a while for the plant to catch up. In June, that plant that was grazed down tight in October is still running behind. And in August, it's finally starting to catch up and producing the similar amount of dry matter to the plant that was grazed only to 6 inches in the previous year. So I'm going to switch gears here just briefly and look at leaf removal versus root growth. This is a common chart. You often hear the idea, take half, leave half, where if we leave 50% of the leaf material, root growth only stops by 2 to 4%. So if we take less than 50% of the volume of the plant in October, that root growth shouldn't stop. And we want that root to keep growing there. So that's one more reason in October to raise your residual height, pull your cattle or your sheep out of your pastures when you're down to 6 inches, so that the roots don't stop growing, so that they can continue to supply water and nutrients from the soil to the tillers and try to encourage as many tillers on that plant to develop and be ready for next year. So here's after 2 years, they're looking at 2 different orchard grass fields, one where they graze down to 4 inches, one the 2 inches. And you can see the 4-inch residue, it's a much thicker sward. There's a lot more growth in this pasture sward here. And here we can see a fair amount of soil. So this is an opportunity for various weeds to get blown in and take root and grow. So one more reason to manage your residual heights. So as a grazier, what should you strive for in the fall of the year? Well, actually, it starts throughout the whole year. You're going to want to practice good management throughout the entire year, making sure that you always are leaving adequate residual when you leave the pasture so that those plants aren't set back. They can continue to capture sunlight and continue to grow at a more rapid pace. And you want to allow adequate rest between grazing plants so that all of those leaves, you get 3 or 4 leaves coming out of that tiller and reaching a mature size before we come back in and graze. But starting in September, I would raise your residual heights up to maybe 6 inches. So this minimizes the impact of the plant's effort to store carbs in the tillers. We're not going to be slowing down root growth. There's going to be plenty of photosynthetic leaf area to capture sun and create carbohydrates to both grow leaf and to start the storage process in the lower parts of the plant in those tillers that it's developing at that time of the year. And once the growing season is over and the plants are dormant, which is going to happen maybe 2 weeks from now, if there's adequate forage, if there's a foot of forage out there, it's a good idea, or it's worth considering grazing that. But you want to be careful. You don't want to graze those dormant plants below 4 or 5 inches, especially with orchard grass. At that point, if you graze it down to 3 inches, you've eaten some of those tillers and some of those stored carbohydrates, and that's going to weaken that plant. It's not going to get through winter with as many intact tillers as if we could have pulled the animals out a little bit sooner. And the other thing I might suggest is that you might want to consider some areas ungrazed to give you the best chance of an earlier start the next year. So if you have a few acres that you don't graze at all, and there's 8 or 10 inches of forage in there, those plants are going to have probably be the first areas where you're going to have green up in the fall. So a couple of additional things I wanted to point out here before I turn it over to Ben. You want to avoid adding too much nitrogen in the fall of the year. If you have a lot of nitrogen added in the fall, it's going to encourage active growth, and it's going to perhaps interfere with the plant wanting to store carbohydrates. So save those N applications for other times of the year. It's important to know that in a healthy pasture sward comprised of primarily perennial cool season grasses, most of the reproduction that occurs in that pasture sward is through tillering. Even though the plant every year produces seed, that seed, much of that doesn't germinate, and the plants that are there, they're just reproducing asexually through tillering. By contrast, annual grasses have to produce that seed, and it's that seed that grows next year and is a plant next year. So if there's a lot of annual plants in our environment that are throwing seed out there, and we don't want to create open spots in our sward to allow those annual grasses, if they're not desired, to take root. And then finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about snow insulating the plants in winter. So if we have more height there, 5 to 6 inches, we're going to have a little bit more snow that's captured and held on those fields, hopefully, when the wind begins to really blow. And that cap of snow, even though it might be only 2 or 3 or 4 inches more, is going to help insulate the ground. It's going to allow those plants to survive winter more easily, and they'll use less carbohydrates making it through the winter, and they'll green up sooner in the spring. It takes a lot of management to do this. It takes a lot of attention, and it's quite easy to have an accident, or maybe we're in a position where we're short on hay and we're going to have to go in and eat some of these pastures down a little bit tighter. So if that happens, one way to think about it is turning lemons into lemonade, and you can go in and spread some seed into those areas. It's a great time to introduce some legumes. You could do that in the fall of the year, or you could frost seed in the spring. You may want to delay turning your animals in the next year to allow those plants a little bit more time to established and ready to be grazed. And you may just need to accept that it happened and just plan differently, and hopefully next year's will go better. And if it's not a continuous occurrence, our pastures are pretty resilient and they'll bounce back pretty quickly if we're getting it right most of the time. That's the great thing about pasture management, is that it's a fairly resilient system.
We're going to cover one of 3 brood cow herds that we have here at Hepler Beef. This is what you see here is the red pole herd, and then we have 2 other commercial groups that we also manage in a similar fashion.
Hello everybody.
Lay out what we're going to
Ben Hepler with Cornell Cooperative Extension in Delaware County, and I'm videoing my cows grazing on some lush pasture in northern Susquehanna County. And this is the group of cows that I will be talking to you about today with the pasture management that I've done this summer. Our farm here at Hepler Beef, we have 2 other herds of commercial cows that we also practice managed rotational grazing with. But these guys glisten in the sun because of the nice red color, so I figured we'd videotape these guys. This is a project that got started in 2007 and has grown from there. The goal right now with these guys is I'm breeding up to be able to finish animals on pasture or on baleage. So I purchase bulls from other herds in the country that share that same vision. Originally the red pole was a dual purpose breed. It was a dairy and a beef breed. today they are mostly selected for beef production, and that's where my trajectory is headed. Although I'm sure if you fed her enough, she'd give quite a bit. But anyway, this is the herd I kept my grazing notes with, so we're going to cover notes and the importance of them for pasture management. We're also going to cover grazing height residual and what I've noticed between different grass species. And we'll take a walk around the pasture and take some measurements. What we're going to do next is we're going to have a series of short videos, partly because I don't know how to combine them all on my iPhone, that shows kind of a time lapse of how the grass grows back. Granted, regrowth this time of year is not going to be what it was, you know, even just a couple weeks ago, but we're going to take you back and go through the different paddocks that I've had this year, and to show you kind of a chronological order in reverse of what the pasture regrowth looks like over time. So what we're looking at right here this has not been grazed on for one day. So there's really no change compared to the previous pasture where I talked about residual height. Residual here is about the same. It's a little bit less, maybe on the hovering 4 and maybe just a touch under 4. But now we'll take you to stuff that hasn't been grazed on for about a week, all the way up to, I think, a month and a half. So let's get started.
So Ben, I have a question. The first video appears to be that paddock was adjacent to this one, and what we saw there was the height that you turned them in.
Yep. Yeah, this is all, this would be paddock 1. Then I had paddock 2, and they were going into paddock number 3, where they were grazing in the first video, if that makes sense.
So they'd been out of this for a day, and would they take that paddock they're in the first video? Would they eat that down to this height in one day?
In that section, yeah, it was a small half circle. This one here in this image that everybody sees was probably a 2-day rotation, and I ended up doing 2.5 days, and that's why the residual was in the 3.5 to 4 inches of the stuff of the stuff they grazed. I mean, they did step on some of it, and some of it was blown down or trampled actually by a herd of deer that I also have, because I have about 20 or 30 of them as well, that take full advantage when the cows aren't there.
Hey Ben, this is Gideon. Apologize for joining late, but how many animals in this group or herd are you managing, and do you have like a paddock size that you're shooting for that 2-day rotation that we're looking at?
So there is, I believe there's 17 mature animals, and then there's I think 15 or 16 calves.
Okay.
And in terms of the 2-day, it's all kind of been trial and error. So what I see, I'll kind of make an educated guess and say, oh, well, this is about the size for 2 days. And then since I drive past the pasture every day, if I start to see it coming due sooner than 2 days, then I'll set up a tape and move them again. That's kind of how I've trained my eye to pick out how large to make it. The proper way is to, use your grazing stick and measure how much dry matter you have available and then go from there.
Okay, so let's look at the third section.
So this is a paddock that in total they were in here for 3 days. The main section was a day, and then I kept giving them a little sliver up the hill. So they have not been here for 4.5 days. It's kind of nice, you can see all the clover leaves taking up the space and growing. But what I want to show here is, so you have this really short grazing height, 2 inches to 0. But then in the same area, I have some different grasses. I have some reed canary grass. I probably have some fescue. I have maybe a little bit of orchard grass. And this residual height, when I fluff everything up, is 7. Actually, it's 10. I have the camera angle weird. Yeah, 10 to 11 inches. So this is where the art comes into play. Is, do you manage for this height, or do you manage for the driveway height that's all bluegrass and clover? So they nip that down to nothing because the growing point's so low and it's a short growing grass and legume to start with. I think the clover is white clover. Now some of this refusal, as we can see here, is right next to a manure paddy. So there's a chance that maybe there's an old one down in here somewhere. I went and dug for it. Yep, there he is. Right there. So that was probably from the first growing season. See that? And cows have pretty good sense of smell, I found out. And they'll refuse stuff for the most part within the last grazing, if they're not grazed too hard. Which is alright by me. I'd rather have them not pick up any parasites or anything that got excreted or now has found a home where an old pat had been. So keeping your residual high also affords you a way to keep your parasite load down, because the parasites, and Rich will probably talk about this as well, they only come up so high on the grass plant. And so if you stay above, you're kind of golden. But I could have probably grazed this a little bit heavier, but I really didn't want them nubbing the driveway down to actual 0, and so we had to live with it. But in areas where manure density was low, the residual height after 4.5 days, the survey says 5 to 6 inches. Now we'll go and show you our next spot. So this pasture here hasn't been grazed on in about a week and a half. And so the clumps of orchard grass are coming back quite nicely. see it pushing up new shoots and stuff like that. It's still pushing up from where it had been grazed. You know, some new leaves haven't quite been visible yet. I think I had this residual at about 5 inches or so. The height of this new growth so far is about 10. But this is also the week. This pasture was grazed during our hard frosts that we had. So some of it where the cows had stepped or where they had laid down on the frost-covered plant, I think those sections had died, frost-killed. At least the surface, anyway. The next place I'll show you, I'll have to check my records and I'll note it in the next video, but I think it's almost been 6 weeks. The grass over where I'm about to show you is mostly timothy, clover, and a few others that I have to brush up on.
Okay, we'll launch into the next one.
This is a good shot of from the last pasture where the cows are grazing and how all that grass is nice and even. Part of that's because, one, of their manure, but also two, of the chicken manure I spread, I broadcasted. And so that got all spread very evenly, so everything kind of grew up at the same level. Out here, this is a wetter section of the field, and you can tell I haven't been out here spreading any nutrients, only the cows have. And all of the clumps of grass you see are all older manure pats from earlier in the year. So that's one nice thing when you're focused on having your grazing herd dense enough for even spread of their own manure. Probably if I had this just a bit tighter and grazed them more, you know, managed them more aggressively, you probably could get a better distribution. You could probably also come back with an ATV or something and drag the pats, but that just takes an extra step, at least in my part here. But it's pretty neat how it all comes together. You know, I have some red clover in here. Right there. And this is reed canary grass too, but I grazed this probably at a better height, a little earlier than before, so it didn't get the woody stalk on it. And so they grazed it low enough to be kind of on par with the other pasture grass species that I have in here. The stuff over by the road, over by the tree line there, that got ahead of me. And I noticed when I grazed the reed canary grass that late in the season, a lot of it ended up just like this guy. Stocky, with all the new growth shooting out from the top instead of tillering from the base. So this made the grass kind of unproductive, and so the cows would nip this top piece off, and then you'd see a sea of brown and you'd think, oh, there's still some roughage, I guess, but you'd go in there and it'd be like a sparsely thinned, like a thinned out forest. They had nibbed the bluegrass underneath right to the ground. And so I actually went through and brush hogged that to make it tiller.
And have you tried like dragging a pasture between rotations, or has anybody else, I guess? It's something I've never done, I guess, same thing, nor have the time to do necessarily, but curious if anybody has any insight on that. its effectiveness of maybe not having as much refusal or more refusal? I don't know.
I haven't. I'm in the same boat as you are, and a lot of times when I'm moving my cows, I have just enough time to park the car, run out, change a fence, and then go to my next job. But does anybody else that's on the call tonight do that?
Yeah.
I've heard people talk anecdotally and say, oh, it makes a difference, and others, no, it's really just a waste of time and fuel. And I think like the classic extension answer is it depends. If you don't have a lot of soil biological activity yet, you might get some benefit from distributing and breaking up those patties. It might help get things going and better. But if you have a established pasture sward and it's fairly healthy, I would think that the soil biology will eventually start to catch up and largely take care of it for you.
Yeah. I also wonder if if you don't sort of just spread that manure smell over the whole paddock and reduce their willingness to graze a bit. So
The other thing is I do know that people that practice multi-species grazing, a species will eat much closer to manure patties of a different species than their own. So I think biologically there's a reason why the animals do refuse the grass that's growing near their own feces for worms and other things. I see that Kim said that she's seen more uniform grazing if they move the herd or flock more frequently, and that would make sense if you're getting the group of animals in a tighter group and they have less time. They're not going to have as much opportunity to be choosy, and they're going to be more likely to just get down to the business of eating because of that flock density or herd density.
okay, let's look at the next walk.
This pasture here that I just spoke about it's been 2 months since the animals have been in this pasture to graze. So you can see how unproductive some of my pasture is. I mean, it didn't even regrow. I mean, right now it's only that sprig says 3.5 inches. But where I was able to get them to poop, it's almost 20 inches tall if I stretch the leaf out. Canopy height anyway. Is in the 14 to 15 range. So we're gonna head over there next.
So Ben, are you going to be coming back to this field this year yet?
After they're done across the road, they'll come back. They'll work their way up the slope, so up the road. I'll probably flash graze the 5-acre part that's up top. I had brush hogged that, so everything's kind of short. And then I'll work my way back down to that 2-month area, come into the field that's here in the middle, and then cross my fingers if I don't get any frozen pipes. They'll stay out as long as they can, as long as the grass allows. But once I start getting hard freezes at night, it's kind of game over. All my pipe is above ground, so then I'll have to bring them back to the barn.
Okay, let's move on.
So this pasture here hasn't been grazed in 6 weeks. We're actually this is the start of the 7th week. So by the end of this week, it'll be 7 weeks. As you can see, this is where I load my cattle out of. My corral system over in the back. The grass here, where the manure pats are, it's about 12 inches tall. Everywhere else is in the 5 to 6 inch range. There's a lot of clover in this field, red and white. this was one of the pastures that I had overgrazed heavily in the fall for 2 years straight. And so the fall of 2019, I made an effort to make sure that I did not overgraze this pasture either in the spring or the fall. And this year, with the help of some chicken manure and keeping a timed rotation to the point where, you know, I wouldn't bring the cows back here until the grass was ready, I've seen quite a bit of difference. And what helped me a lot with that, to make sure I stayed on a schedule and didn't go, oh, where do I go next? I took notes. And I know Troy Bishop has the big calendar, which works great because it tracks everything. But being my first year taking notes, I felt that the calendar was a little daunting. So I just used the Notes app on my phone. After moving my cows every day, I would just take a quick second and type in, you know, moved my cows to the next break. You know, and somebody else reading it wouldn't know what I was talking about. But since I was the only one managing this herd of cows, I was the only one that needed to remember what that meant. And so some of our regrowth here, you know, just at canopy height, which is similar to what we do for scissor cuts, is about 8 inches tall, 8 to 9 inches tall. Over here you got 12 to 13. And being able to keep track with that Notes app really helped me be able to visualize the time cycle that this property was able to let me do with this group of cows. I was able to see if I stayed on track between the first grazing and the second. Did I keep the same number of days between the second grazing and the third? And I didn't. Actually, I started cutting back I was ending up 5 days sooner getting back to the same place. It worked out this year with the way the grass grew. I had about a 60-day rotation, which is long. Rich will tell you that that's the perfect number for sheep. It's probably the perfect number for cows too, but the grass did get a little ahead of me, as I showed you with the reed canary grass. But for the most part, being able to graze quickly with that 2-day cycle, I didn't have much of the grass get ahead of me. I'm not sure if that was lack of nutrients, so the grass just took longer to regrow, or if it just worked out with moisture and the way things went this year.
How many total acres?
I was really fortunate that I took the time to take notes, even if it was just a quick blurb. I even got in the habit on the same Notes app, when I would move my cows, I would also mention if I saw anybody getting bred. And that helps. I mean, you always look at it, and if you forget to write it down somewhere, and then you get back to the house and forget to write it on the calendar, and then come next spring you're like, oh man, when should I let the cows out? And then there's a calf in the barn. You're like, ah. But taking notes has definitely helped in being able to manage the grass and manage the cows. Being able to see if you're like coming back up on your previous rotation sooner than you'd think you'd like to see it. You know, the grass might be ready to be grazed, but you'd like to give it a couple more days. You know, you're able to slow your rotation down by either bringing them off a pasture, which there's a few farms in Delaware County that do that have limited pasture. They bring their whole herd off, they feed them hay for a week or two, just so that way the rotation is on schedule. and then they let them back out again. For me, at the other farm, we have some areas we weren't able to fertilize the last couple years, and we've overgrazed them a little bit. And we're going to feed hay on the last day that they're grazing, so that way they'll probably still overgraze, but they won't nip anything that's trying to grow back. At least that's the goal anyway. It's all management. It's all a lot of fun.
So Hartley, you had a question.
I was just wondering what the total acreage of pasture he's working with is. If he has a 60-day rotation.
Yeah, so the main pasture that I grazed for most of the summer was it was either 28 or 30 acres. And then this fall, I brought in another 8. Where the cows were grazing at the beginning of all this, we had actually made mulch hay there in July. That's also why it grew up all nice and even, because we had mowed it. So generally speaking, it was about 30 acres for 20 cows. I think I had, 18 to 20 cows.
I do want to talk a little bit about infrastructure, because without at least some infrastructure, none of this would be possible. For one, I would not be able to bring my cows out here or take them back home if I didn't have some way to pen them up and work them efficiently. The permanent fence on the perimeter gives me peace of mind at night. The pasture out there by the barn last year was only perimetered by and I would get calls all the time that my calves were running around on the road. And that's never a good phone call to get. And then the final thing is water. At prime locations. One of the reasons that made this property advantageous to convert it from being a hay ground to pasture ground is the landowner had built a pond halfway up the hillside, fed by a spring that runs year-round, and I was able to siphon water out of that and run it through 3/4 inch black farm pipe and feed it to, I believe I have 6 hookups, 6 or 7, and they range from here, which was the original one, and I also have it running out to that barn over there and across the road where those cows are grazing now. If I had to rely on streams or spring seeps to let the cows drink, I wouldn't be able to use across the road. I would be able to use these 2 fields, but I'd be severely limited in how I section off the pasture for them to graze in the way I want to manage. So sometimes you have to get creative. At the home farm, we were fortunate we were able to get EQIP funding for spring developments on most of our pastures over there. I mean, but that's 20 years in the making. I was able to set all this up in a season for a fraction of the cost. But at the same time, it's not very robust. I mean, I'll show you right here. If a cow steps just right, luckily nothing's happened yet, but she could snap that right off. I've had cows kink the black pipe, so then the water drain, gets low because they suck it all out, and then they tip it over, break the pipe, and then the water is running all over the ground. So there's frustrations with something that was cheap to install. but it lets me at least manage the grass the way I want to. And that's what's important to me. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this little mini pasture walk. I know I have. This is my first time videoing the hard work I've put in all year and talking about it. I'm not one to talk too much. But thank you all for listening.
Ben, I noticed you had probably 100-gallon troughs or 150s. I've had the low profile, the 50-gallon troughs for a long time. It seems. I think the first project we ever did with the watershed, was a spring development. We had the 50 gallons to make sure that the calves could reach. And I guess maybe it's as much a question for Rich as you, but is it that important? I calve in April, so they're on pasture all summer. I'm just throwing that out there as a idea or thought.
So Gideon, as part of your question, how important is it that the small calves can reach the water trough?
Yes.
So this one here, the calves do have an issue drinking out of because the ground around it has kind of subsided, eroded a little bit, I guess you could say. And I do have the float down a little bit. I have 2 other 100-gallon troughs, and I have the float as high as I can possibly get it and still accommodate uneven ground. And I would say by midsummer, those calves are tall enough to be able to reach in and drink, and I don't have an issue. And I also have a mineral feeder, and surprisingly, it's the calves that go after it like gangbusters, and once in a while I'll see a cow do it. It's kind of neat.
So that question has been researched, and if the animal has to reach over and down in to drink, the throat will begin to interfere. And so if that's the type of water system you had where the water is a ways down in the tank for a younger animal 5 months of age, you wouldn't want that to be much higher than 14 inches. But if the water is near the top of that tank and it doesn't have to reach over the tank to get to the water, 28 inches, 26 inches, 28 inches, calf should still be able to drink. And yes, we want the calves to be able to drink.
Around the 1st of June, do all your pastures get ahead of you?
The short answer is yes. Where my bane, my reed canary issue got ahead of me about that time. If I would have moved I think I probably had 2 options that I didn't know then. I could have moved my cows faster, so just nipping off the top, or I could have probably mowed that for hay. The only problem is I have above ground water line running right through all that reed canary grass, and the grass has buried some of it, but some of it isn't buried. And from experience the previous year, sometimes the disc mower does find the pipe.
At the beginning of the season, do you plan to bush hog every paddock?
No, actually I haven't. The only thing I brush hogged this year was that reed canary grass. If at the home farm, we did graze some grass it was reed canary grass and a little bit of timothy in the mix, and that stuff was like 4 or 5 foot tall. And what I did was we grazed it super tight, and so the cows basically ate what they want and flattened everything else. And the regrowth really wasn't that great, but at least I didn't have to go back in and with a piece of equipment and bush hog it down.
That's a great question, and it's really hard with these cool season grasses to stop the reproduction from happening and for those seed heads to shoot up. They're really biologically driven to do that, and I think Ben's idea of increasing the density such that they get trampled and you fold those over, if we can set back that reproduction in some way, I think that's going to allow that plant to do some tillering. Whereas if you don't have the density in there and those cool season grasses are sending their heads up and you just eat through and you don't knock anything down, you don't come back and clip, those plants are going to continue to focus on finishing that reproductive cycle and they won't start to tiller. So if you've gone into a pasture situation at that time of the year and you've taken your animals out and most of those seed heads are still standing, I would think it would be worthwhile to go in and clip to stop that process and trigger that plant into doing a little bit of tillering and starting that vegetative growth a little bit earlier.
If you wanted to try to trample it down, you would need to set your paddock size smaller, right? To get them to accomplish that trampling.
Right. Yeah. So you're going to have they're going to be in that section for a shorter period of time. But if you can go in and rotate twice a day, you'll have probably 50, 60,000 pounds of animals per acre while you're in there. And they'll probably do a pretty decent job of trampling. But that's how you do it. You give them a smaller area. They're in there for a shorter period of time, and then you move them along.
It seems like if you give them smaller areas, that just worsens the problem at the end because you're slowing the rotation down.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Now, if some of your pastures can also be hay fields, that's the most common way in some areas of the United States that we deal with that. Once some of those fields start to get heading out, we go in and make a cutting of hay. But if our pastures aren't suitable for making hay, then that's a different challenge. So then some strategies are early in the year, you run through quickly and you're just topping the grass and you do the best you can. But it's a struggle we all share. I don't know of anyone that's really solved it entirely.
But I think it varies so much year to year. I mean, just looking back at last year, I started grazing a lot later than I did this year. And a lot of that was because we were getting so much moisture in May last year. And a lot of my soils are Pasture and river bottom. So I hesitate to get them out too early on that. But what that did was I had a lot of very mature pasture, and it really set me back for the whole season because just to get them through and then clip and get that grass coming back, it wasn't a 20-day rotation, to get that regrowth because the grass had progressed so much. So, whereas this year I actually did less first cutting on fields that I had historically and grazed them because I needed to. So it's such a variable just year to year and what Mother Nature is dealing you.
I agree. So in these two photos, I just wanted to show everybody the difference between a new grass tip and one that had elongated after being grazed. And so when you're measuring your pastures to go back in, I mean, it's probably a little obvious, but measure to that new grass tip, not so much the old one. And then here I just wanted to show everybody in a still because I didn't know how good the video was going to be. Pictorially what the rest looked like at different intervals.
If not, thank you to everyone. I wish you all a good night, and I hope that we see you next week, where we will be talking about stockpiling pastures, intentionally setting some pasture areas aside to be eaten in October or later in the year. And the pasture walk will be at the Kim Casano farm. She's my wife, and so you'll get to see what we're doing in the pasture walk portion of next week's presentation.